Hello everyone, my name is Ben Eady and I'm the Online Media Manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Using Visio 2010 and SharePoint 2010 for Process Management, Practical Tips and Customer Examples. Today's featured speaker is Chris Crane, the Director of MS Visio at Microsoft, and AJ Bryant, a Senior Product Manager. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including a Q&A session, so make sure to submit your questions in advance using the question feature on the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to Microsoft for sponsoring this event, and at this time I'll turn it over to Chris to get us started.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Chris Crane, and with me is AJ Bryant.
Hi everybody, great to be here.
Over the next roughly 45 minutes, we're going to take you through a lot of content that are focused very much on how you can use Visio 2010 and SharePoint 2010 and now SharePoint in the cloud, or what we call Office 365, to do quite a number of business process management related tasks. I think you'll find a lot of what we have is new, and we're hoping that you'll find it quite interesting. The idea is to give you something very practical that you can go off and work with when you leave the session. Now, Microsoft historically has taken a very broad view of process management. We want to make it as inclusive as possible in terms of the roles that are involved. And we also take a sort of a disciplinary view that's quite expansive. We include business process management, enterprise content management, and of course, quality and compliance. And we've made investments in these areas in 2010 to help you get more out of Visio and SharePoint in those areas. Now, I think the main thing I want you to take away from this webinar, if you're not already using Visio 2010 and SharePoint 2010, is that Visio 2010, particularly when used with SharePoint, is a very different tool than what you may be using at work if you're using Visio 2007 or even an earlier version. And in 2010, we made a number of important investments that are directly related to what you guys do, process improvement. Those really are summarized on the left here. The first is ease of use. How do we just make it quicker and easier for you to capture business processes? How do you save time, in other words? The second is really moving Visio from the realm of drawing or capturing a process into actually executing and visualizing a process. We've done that with SharePoint Workflow, and we'll show you that a little bit later on. And then the third area, Visio Services, is one that I'm really most excited about, and I think has broad applicability to all of you who are attending the webinar. This is the ability to share your Visio diagrams, and particularly those that are connected to data sources, with others via the browser, even if they don't have Visio installed on their local machines. And again, we'll show you that. Now, we're going to walk through these topics really in what we call a maturity model to give you a way to think about it. Starting at the bottom here with moving from sticky notes, maybe on a whiteboard or butcher block paper, to Visio, standardizing notation. We'll talk about BPMN today a little bit. Automating human and document-centric workflow. That's the SharePoint workflow template, and we just talked about. And then ultimately connecting your Visio diagrams to data sources like Excel or SharePoint lists or even SQL, and turning them into a form of business activity monitoring. We don't think the progression up these different steps from 1 through 4 is actually that steep. We think that there's something that many of you on the phone could do and get value from very quickly, and we'll talk about how customers are already doing that today. With that, let me turn it over to AJ, who's going to walk you through a little bit of the ease of use and time savings that we built into the latest version of Visio.
Great, thanks Chris. And so just to jump into this, part of the reason why we make that statement that going up through that maturity model curve, we think it's not that steep, is because of the basic ease of use and simplicity that's baked into Visio 2010. So let's go ahead and just start in Visio. And I'm going to go ahead here, and this is what we call the backstage view. And for those of you using Office 2010, you should be familiar with this view. And this is the area across the different Office applications and products like Visio and Project where you go to do things either when you're starting up an application or you're closing out in terms of saving or sharing. So if we go ahead into this backstage view and I click New, I'm in the area for templates. And for templates, Visio Premium 2010 ships with 66 different templates included. And obviously for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to focus in on some of the business and flowchart process-related templates. And so here, right within the flowchart category, I can select from 7 templates here, and we're going to use the cross-functional flowchart. Probably a template, probably an experience a lot of you are familiar with when you're doing some of this basic, capturing paper-based processes or whiteboard-based processes. So the ribbon is one aspect, or excuse me, the backstage is one aspect that's very familiar with this experience, whether you're a user of a previous version of Visio, or if some of your colleagues perhaps are working on a process in collaborative ways, they might just be familiar with Microsoft Office. That backstage is familiar. Now this other view here called the ribbon, where Microsoft has gone ahead and organized some of the key functionality by these categories or tabs to enable us to surface the most heavily used, the most important functionalities to make them more easily discoverable for people, whether they're experts at using the product or whether they are new to the product. So this is the ribbon user interface. And so let's go ahead with that in mind and start out a process diagram the way any of us would with the star shape. So the experience here is very simply we grab from the stencil on the left and drag across to the right. And right away as I'm doing that, you can probably see, let me zoom in a bit and highlight this for you, but you can probably see that experience when I did that, the highlighted orange areas that are sort of the guideposts for me. It shows me that I'm centered in the swim lane and how I'm pivoted in the diagram. So if I go ahead and continue progression, I'll use this feature called a Quick Shapes Mini Toolbar. So I highlight to the right of the shape, and it automatically gives me the most likely next shapes I'm going to use for this diagram. So pretty quickly, I can go across and down through the swim lanes here and create and get that basic whiteboard diagram, that basic process diagram created. So in some cases, certainly there's going to be other elements to this, and so I can go ahead and use the Quick Shapes Mini Toolbar to go ahead and connect to that shape that wasn't one of the most prominent ones. And so it's just a simple progression across the page. And so part of what I've shown you is the ability to simply use this dynamic grid to make sure these shapes land where you want them to land. Let me add a data shape here, and you'll see when I bring this in, it again will show me, I'm in line with everything else in the swim lane. I can go ahead and drop it there, and I can go ahead and add a connection point. So that's some of the basics. Now, the other thing that you encounter when you're working with a diagram is sometimes you may have placed a shape that, I don't want that there anymore. So if I look at this process shape here in this second swim lane, turns out I don't want that. If I just simply right-click on it and cut it, the diagram will self-heal, meaning that connection point between this decision point and this process point, the connector remained even though I took out the intermediate shape. Similarly, if I want to go ahead and say, actually I'm going to draw, I have a custom function I'm going to drop on the page right there, and I'm going to go ahead and put it between these shapes. It'll go ahead and automatically add it in there. Now, so if I put it up in a strange place like this, where it doesn't look that great, I can go ahead and use the Home tab, and you can click Auto Align in Space, and then the diagram, as you can see, let me do that again. The diagram, goes from something that was a little bit less visually appealing with this jagged edge right here, and I go ahead and click with one button, Auto Align in Space, and the diagram looks better. So that's part of just adding and deleting content and making sure it all fits quickly and nicely. Another great feature in Visio 2010 is this feature we call sub-processes. So if I went ahead and said, this diagram has gotten a little more complicated than I realized, and actually these steps here that I'm grabbing, these steps are all actually a sub-process. I can go up here to the Process tab after highlighting those areas and click Create from Selection. And what that's going to go ahead and do is automatically create a sub-process for me. And now, as you can see, it's created this sub-process shape as defined over here in the stencil. And what happens is it's created a page 2. So similar to an Excel tab view, you've got your primary view, and you've got your next tab, and you can get to that by clicking over here on page 2. Or there's a hyperlink, actually, that Visio has created right there. I can Control-click, hit page 2, and I'm right there into the area of the sub-process. And so, we showed you a bunch of just basic things that you can use to be, number one, familiar with Visio, because it's got the ribbon interface, and it behaves in a way that's familiar to you, whether you're using an older version or whether you've been using Office. And then we talked about a bunch of the ways to quickly create some of these diagrams. One last point I want to make on this score before we talk a little bit about the functionality in the specific cross-functional flowchart is, it's been we've heard the feedback before in terms of, hey, it might be a bit of a bugaboo to format once I go off page, or if I add a shape that goes beyond my current canvas. And so when I do that here, you can see what happens with Visio is that the canvas actually extended, and we call this auto page. And so I accidentally used the off page reference shape there. I shouldn't have used that. But as you can see, the canvas extended, and so I didn't need to say, hey, I need to think about where am I putting these shapes. The canvas automatically extends based upon what I'm putting in the diagram. So that's another nice quick feature. Let me delete that shape. So let's now that we've got this basic diagram created, let's show some of the ways you can format it in a way where everything is more visually appealing to some of the people you might be working with. So I go up here to the Design tab, and similar to some of the options you might have in PowerPoint, I can quickly add effects and colors. And the great thing here is I can go ahead and format them. So if I want to go ahead and add this color scheme, it previews it for me before I accept the change. And I can go ahead and change the way some of the edges are represented. Some things are soft or straight line, et cetera, and go ahead and do that. And so, and lastly, I can make a background change to, again, make this more something you might want to more visually appealing to people you want to share with. And so with a few quick clicks, I was able to add polish and make this maybe a little bit more visually appealing to people who don't live and breathe Visio every day. The last thing I want to do is go back up into the ribbon view and talk about some of the functionalities baked into this cross-functional flowchart. So part of a flowchart is the ability to quickly add or remove swim lanes, and so you can do that right up here. And the great thing here is that within the diagram, if I go ahead and I add something in this new swim lane, and it turns out that we think this swim lane is really important. It sort of represents our executives and what they're doing in this process. And we realize that, when we share this, we're going to want what they're doing bubbled to the top. I can quickly just grab this swim lane, move it, and the relationships I've made between the different process steps remain intact via that simple drag and drop. And so there's a lot of functionality here. And we think, and let me transition back to our presentation. With the functionality here, we think, we're pretty convicted about this actually, that by doing just basic things, leveraging the familiar Office interface, knowing how the application is going to behave, and it behaves the way you expect it to, then the ability to quickly create compelling process diagrams, we think customers can get a lot of benefit just from these very basic things. And what you see on this slide, and I'm not going to read through it, is the experience of Global Crossing, which is obviously a significant firm, and they use Visio in a very frontline way in some of their important processes, and that's in terms of how they respond to requests for proposals in their sales processes. And with Visio, as you can see the quote here, they're saving up to 25% of the time in something that's very important to them. And so at the end of the day, they're bidding on work more effectively. They're creating better bids, and they're creating more bids. And so Visio, used in a very simple way, is having positive impact for a significant company like Global Crossing. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Chris, and he's going to talk to you about taking this basic step and how to transition to that second maturity.
Thanks, Adrian. So just to kind of summarize what we showed you, because it's very, very quick, we invested a lot in ease of use. We made it easier to work with your swim lane diagrams, which, of course, is a very, very common diagram type. It shows up in the BPMN diagram I'll show you in a second. Much faster to create the diagram through the quick shapes in the toolbar, easier to insert shapes, which has been a pain to some degree in the past with Visio, delete shapes, it self-heals, align the shapes and auto-space them. And then obviously, he showed you the ability to create a sub-process from a large diagram with a single click. So just things to make it quicker and easier. And these work across all the diagram types, not just with what he showed you. Now, the second area I want to talk about is kind of moving beyond just ease of use and the quick capture into standardization of processes. And I'm going to do this by talking about how Microsoft actually uses the new BPMN template in Visio 2010. So let me go over to that. I'll return to Visio. I'll bring up a sample process here. This is a hiring process, a sample hiring process from our HR department. And Microsoft actually has three different, or actually has a problem when we hire across multiple subs in the past. We have employees in well over 100 subsidiaries outside of North America. And we were doing hiring and other HR processes a little bit differently across those subsidiaries. And this led to the typical inefficiencies you would expect in terms of capturing inconsistent information, having different processes meant it was very difficult to benchmark processes, It was harder to train people that came in to actually use those processes. And it meant we were doing things inconsistently when we try to be consistent across subsidiaries to the extent we can be. So I'm going to show you sort of 3 ways that we standardize, that we use standardization with BPMN here. The first is, let me zoom in a little bit for you so that you can probably see this a little bit more on your screen. I'll come over to here and I'll scroll up a little bit. Okay, so we'll look at part of this process. This is using the new BPMN template in Visio 2010. We provide complete support for the 1.2 standard. That means we have stencils that include all 135 shapes. The challenge with this is that that's a lot of shapes. There's a lot of complexity. And so at Microsoft, we are using BPMN 1.2, but we elected to go with just the basic BPMN shapes, the ones you see over here in the shapes window. That doesn't mean that all the shapes aren't there. If I go over, say, to an event here and I right-click, you can see that I have the ability here to select the event type, and I can also pick the trigger result. So if I want to use the full notation, I can do that by right-clicking. But for people that are less familiar with BPMN, this gives them just a limited set of shapes to work with. The same is true if I look at, say, a gateway type. You can see that I can, with one click, make this, say, an exclusive event, and it makes that change. So standardizing notation has made it a lot easier for us to communicate processes internally and have a consistent way of communicating processes across all of our international subsidiaries. The second way that we standardized information using BPMN is we standardize the set of attributes that we capture about a process, because that's obviously important too. You've long been able to add data to Visio shapes. If you're a longtime Visio user, you know that that's not new. But we make it very easy here to standardize the information that you capture. So one way of doing that is by using drop-down lists rather than by having people type in information. So we've done this by putting in a series of simple drop-downs. Is it optional or is it mandatory? You know, what's the frequency of the process? And this is easy for you guys to customize to fit your own processes and your own circumstances. Once we've captured that information, we want to be able to compare it across subsidiaries. And so we use a feature that's been available in Visio for quite a while. In 2010, it's called Shapes Reports. Clicking on this button exports all of the shape data into Excel or into an XML file so that then you can look at it in terms of quality and compliance issues. So we've standardized our notation and hence standardized our processes. We've standardized the attributes we capture about those processes to make it easier for us to compare processes across subsidiaries and also to ensure good compliance. And then we've also standardized the processes against business process modeling notation rules that we ship out of the box. So if I go over to the Process tab, you'll see that there's a check diagram button up here. And this is really new. If you think about Visio historically, we've been, again, a way of capturing the processes, of representing the processes, but people say these aren't sort of structured processes. They're not a process model that ultimately could be executed later. And so with Visio 2010, we've added in support for business rules out of the box. We ship the full BPMN standard rules. We ship SharePoint workflow rules. And we ship a set of basic flowcharting rules. Do I have a start and end shape? Are all my shapes connected? You know, do my gateways have conditions labeled? This sort of thing. But the important thing for you is that these rules can also be customized. And so you have the ability now to validate your process against rules we ship in the box, but also against rules you may want to develop based on your own industry, some government regulations, the country you live in, or perhaps just company standards that you have and you want to make sure that they comply with. So you can validate these models now against multiple rules. Now, let me show you what happens in this simple example if I validate against the BPMN rules that come out of the box. I'm going to just click on the check diagram button. And what you can see below is that a new, what we call issues window appears. And you have, if you can't read this, it says there's a rule. So this is just plain English. This is the rule. a sequence flow must not cross a pool boundary, for example. And then it tells you the category or the actual notation type that it corresponds to. If I click on, say, this one here, you'll see that it moves me over here and it's highlighted as provide relocation services. And so this takes the user to the source of the problem and points them to the problem and explains the problem, and then makes it much easier for them to fix the issue in the model. I think of this as sort of an advanced form of ease of use, building on what AJ just showed you. It makes it easier for you to introduce BPMN to more users within the organization and to give them a way to create these diagrams and kind of guide them through it. For us, it's also an important form of compliance because it means that we can validate our processes against a set of rules, and we know that they've been validated. And we can then take them and we can store them and control them within SharePoint 2010 in a new process repository that's there. So if we step back from BPMN, how are we using it? We're standardizing it 3 ways at Microsoft. We are standardizing notation, we are standardizing the process attributes that we capture, and we are also being able to validate or standardize the model against a set of business rules. Now I know that a number of you on the phone also do simulation as part of optimizing processes. And some of you may have noticed the simulation tab up here. The Fluent UI from Microsoft is very extensible, and so we're fortunate to have a number of customers that have actually developed add-ins to Visio 2010 that do simulation. The one that I'm showing you here is by Global 360. It's called Analyst View. And if you're interested in more on BPMN and simulation, there was a very good webinar that Microsoft and Global 360 did about a year ago, and you can find it in the Modern Analyst webinar archives. We also have other partners that provide add-ins. ProModel provides a very nice simulation add-in that works with a variety of diagram types within Visio. Temptation over in Germany. So you have quite a choice. And the beauty is that you interact, you do your simulation very much as you would within Visio. You're still within Visio, and you're not having to leave and use a separate tool. Now, I won't go deeply into the benefits to Microsoft. I think those of you that have been working in process a long time, you get it. But basically, we're saving time. We are saving time in training in terms of onboarding new employees. We're better able to benchmark and identify best practices across subsidiaries. And of course, we can make better decision making. So we've moved from sort of ease of use, and all of those ease of use features apply to BPMN, now to standardizing the notation, standardizing the information, standardizing against rules, structured diagrams. Let's talk about going now into a really new realm for Visio, and that's taking a structured diagram, a model, and created in Visio, and ultimately using that to execute, to automate a workflow in SharePoint 2010, and then also be able to visualize the current status of that instance of the workflow in SharePoint 2010, all without any coding.
Great. So thanks, Chris. I'm absolutely going to take you guys through this maturity model, and to us, it's really about Visio, using Visio to help you land your process improvement efforts. As we all know, that everyone works on processes as a goal towards improvement, and landing that is one of the big things we try to address with this release of Visio 2010 in conjunction or in collaboration with some of the features of SharePoint 2010 and now Office 365. And the issue, as we see it, is that when IT and business collaborate on a process improvement initiative, the language they speak when you're actually going through that effort, sometimes you're speaking different languages, and so when you're trying to drive a compliance initiative or going after efforts to reduce errors, improve quality, or just land workflows that are essentially human or document centric, that language barrier in terms of business analyst speak versus IT speak can be sometimes cumbersome to overcome and result in processes that don't land effectively or aren't optimal. And so let's use an example to show you how Visio plus SharePoint addresses this challenge nowadays. So if I go back into Visio and I pull in or I open up a diagram, this is what we call a SharePoint workflow diagram. And so if you remember when I was showing you the basic cross-functional flowchart, right here within Visio Premium 2010. You go ahead and click Open in the Backstage view within the flowchart category. There's a specific template for Microsoft SharePoint workflows. So you went ahead and open that. I'm not going to show you the exercise of creating the workflow. You can see this is a very simple example. It's a very basic workflow. As you can imagine, it wouldn't have taken much longer to create than the basic cross-functional flowchart I created earlier. But the key thing here is, this is a specific chart with specific business rules to the SharePoint environment. And so if you look at some of these shapes on the left here, the start and the terminate, it's very similar to a cross-functional flowchart diagram, but they have their own shapes. And then some of the conditional rules, check for permissions, title contains keywords, etc., are specific to actually landing the workflow in a SharePoint environment. So this document, or this Visio diagram, creates all, or contains all of those rules. So that's the basic, view of the diagram. If we go here to the Review tab, or excuse me, to the Process tab, as someone who's a business analyst, I'm working on this, and I may not be that intimately familiar with the SharePoint rules, the SharePoint workflow rules. Similar to how Chris ran the diagram check with the BPMN template, the same ability to validate the process exists here, but it's validating against the SharePoint workflow rules. And this is really important because this notion of business rules here, when you're talking about SharePoint, this notion of business rules is critical because these are rules that SharePoint has for that workflow to land effectively. So let me check the diagram. I removed one of the categories, and it turns out there's an error. So I removed a conditional no after the approval decision point. So right here, similar to Chris's experience with the BPMN diagram, it points out to me exactly where the issue is. It basically says the position shape isn't labeled with yes or no. So if I go to this shape and I go ahead and quickly with Visio's ease of use, add the no, and I revalidate the diagram, and the diagram is now correct. And so at this point is where things get really interesting in the interplay between Visio and SharePoint. So we have this feature here called Export, and you can export the SharePoint workflow for editing in Microsoft SharePoint Designer. Now let me flip over back to the PowerPoint presentation. SharePoint Designer is a free tool that IT professionals in your organization use. And as you can see here, it's a list-based tool. It's a tool that the people in your organization, if you're using a SharePoint environment, use to actually go ahead and land things on SharePoint. And so that workflow visualization that the business analyst created using Visio in an intuitive, simple way that makes sense, they go ahead and click the export function, and that export-import function is here in the SharePoint Designer tool as well. Then that IT pro can go ahead and consume your proposed SharePoint workflow in a format that's a list-based format that's familiar to them, and that's what we see here on this screen. Now, importantly, and this is where we feel like the communications gap or barrier starts to come down when you're working with the tool set between Visio and SharePoint, is that the IT professional and the business analyst have the ability to do this importing and exporting in and out of Visio. And so as it gives you basically the ability to collaborate effectively on what you actually want that workflow to look like, and what are some of the limitations, the rules of the workflow, et cetera. If it allows those two different people to have an effective collaboration. So the IT pro in this case can do some editing with a list-based view and then export back to Visio and share it back with the analyst. And you can continue to discuss until the workflow is optimized. What you see here as the green highlight is actually another very important step, and that's when everyone is satisfied with what the workflow is going to look like. And the IT pro has the ability to quickly just basically export and publish this workflow to an active live SharePoint environment. So what's going on there is you are actually now, this workflow is live. And so let's switch to that view. So if you recall, this is very similar to the Visio diagram I was working on. In fact, it is the Visio diagram I was working on, but we are now in a SharePoint environment. And so what that means is this is no longer, I don't have to have the Visio application open. I, as a customer whose IT infrastructure includes SharePoint 2010 or Office 365, I'm now on an intranet or internet-based dashboard, and I'm consuming this Visio services, this diagram, in a technology called Visio Services. And so, as you can see, if you are someone with Visio on your machine, you can go ahead and open up in Visio and do some editing. But this is for consuming the process. And so this workflow is live in SharePoint. And so we're at a point in the process where, and let me back up for a minute and set up what this process actually is. This is a process we set up that says, hey, whenever we're doing procurement, we want to make sure that if it's above a certain dollar amount, that the process gets routed through the right decision chain and the right approval chain. So in this case, we set up the workflow to be for anything greater than $50,000 sets off an approval workflow. And so in this case, you can see where we are with the visualization that right now the workflow has started off that someone has said, hey, I want to purchase something for $50,000, but there's a person over here who's a director named Andy who has not yet signed off on the procurement request. And so right here, if Andy logs in to his SharePoint view, he sees that he's got an issue pending, an assigned task saying review the purchase request. So he goes ahead and says, I'm going to review that request. As you can see, he hasn't started it yet, and it tells him who has requested the change, and there's some background around why this person wants to spend $50,000. So for the purposes of this example, I'm going to go ahead and approve this request, and what you're going to see is the actual workflow update. So you can see now a big checkbox here where it says the director has approved. And so you can see now it's moved further along, and the next person in the approval process is now going to get the similar sort of workflow request. And so at the end of the day, with this one, let's get back to the PowerPoint presentation. This is ultimately a way for us to go from take the business modeling from concept to actually landing in the business in a very visual and intuitive way for people in your organizations. And so everyone can participate in this process, from the business analysts who are designing the workflow, from IT who's actually in charge of implementing the workflow, to the people who actually consume and participate in the workflow. And what was great about this process was it was intuitive for everyone at every stage, and at the end result required no coding. Let me repeat that. Visio was used up front, SharePoint was used in the middle to execute, and Visio and SharePoint were used to land the process, and all along the way there was no coding required. And so what we show here in this case is the Austrian Ministry of the Interior, which is basically the Austrian Police Department for the whole country. And they ran into a problem where they were dealing with two key factors. They were, number one, in an environment which is familiar to a lot of us, which was they had to cut budget and cost reduction. And number two, they were trying to be a greener outfit, less paper, less waste, et cetera. And so when we approached them about Visio 2010 and SharePoint 2010, they were able to leverage this same workflow-based approach to better empower their frontline people. In this case, it's police officers, and they were bogged down in a previous environment with a paper-based process that was costly to deliver and inefficient, where they couldn't even get cell phones efficiently to their officers, or mobile phones efficiently to their officers. So using Visio 2010 and SharePoint 2010 in a workflow-based approach, they streamlined that process. Obviously, they saved time, they cut waste, and ultimately they cut budget. And so that's the next layer. That's the maturity level 3 of what is possible with Visio plus SharePoint. And now I'm going to turn it back to Chris, and he's going to talk about business activity monitoring.
Okay, thanks, AJ. So just to kind of summarize what we've showed you, because we're moving intentionally fast to give you kind of the a la carte view, or the very quick view of some of the new capabilities within Visio and SharePoint 2010. We've talked about ease of use. We've showed you how that applies broadly. We've talked about standardizing process notation, attributes, business rules, taking that with SharePoint workflow and being able to now actually automate processes that relate to sort of humans and documents and the way that they interact together using SharePoint 2010 and Office 365. Now, I want to take you to what I think is perhaps one of the more exciting and actually very accessible new features in 2010 for all of you, and that's the ability to connect your process diagrams to data sources to get to this dashboard or business activity monitoring running in SharePoint 2010. And so to do that, I'm going to go back over to Visio, and I am going to switch diagrams here, and I'll bring up a process that is related to bringing a new product to market. So I have a fairly simple process, but it has quite a number of steps here. And then I want to connect this to a couple of data sources that have information related to how is the process actually going. So I'll come up here and I'm going to go to a spreadsheet. Now this is Excel, and this is Excel in SharePoint 2010 running there as a file. And you'll see here that I have the date, the process steps here, and then have the status. Are they in progress? Are they completed? Or are they not started? I have a second data source here we call a SharePoint list. This is just data within SharePoint that you can connect to. I have the same set of process steps here, and then I have on the right-hand side, hopefully you can see this, the average number of days it's taking to complete each of the process steps. And what I want to do is sort of break down these silos of information, two different data sources from the process, and bring that all together in a very visual way that you can do, and I think the people on your team will benefit from. Oops. Bring you back to the, okay. So to do that, I'm going to go over to the Data tab here, and I'm going to click on Connect Data to Shapes. And when I do that, we bring up a very simple wizard here that exposes the data sources you can connect to. Microsoft Excel, Access, the SharePoint list, of course Microsoft SQL Server, but you can also attach to Oracle databases or to SAP databases or other forms of data that you may have in your organization. I'll start with that Excel workbook. I'll click Next, and I will select it here, and I will go on. And if I actually want to filter that data, you know, if I had a huge data set and wanted to bring in a subset, I would do that here, but I'll skip that and I'll go on and I'll finish. And what that's done is it's opened what we call an external data window here down below the diagram. This is, in essence, a copy of that data from the Excel spreadsheet, but it is a dynamic copy of that, meaning that when the Excel data that I showed you refreshes, the data here will also refresh. Now I'm going to repeat that process and bring in the SharePoint list. So this time I'll select the SharePoint list, select Next, and I'm going to bring what's called process data from this list of different SharePoint lists, and then I'm going to finish. And now I have two data windows below. You can see tabs very similar to all the Microsoft products. I have SharePoint list data here with a set of steps, and if I click at the bottom here, I'm back in my Excel data. Both of these are dynamically linked now to the file. And what I want to do is link now the data to specific process steps so that I can get to this common view. I will zoom in here, and so you can see a little bit better. Okay. And I think I'll zoom in a little bit more. Hopefully that's visible. So you can see here I have a first step here, collect the requirements. And then I have a list of data down here, and here's collect the requirements. So I can simply drag and drop at the left click, and I just drag it up. And you'll see that a little link symbol here appears showing that this data is linked to something on the diagram. Now, I'm not going to repeat that process. We actually have an automated way to do that where I can go back to the Data tab, click on Automatically Link, and it gives me different ways to associate it. In this case, I'm going to pick the column name here, which is right this column here that lists the different process steps, and I'm going to link it to the shaped text here. So I'll click Finish, and now all of the data in this external data window is linked to my process. I'll go back over to the Excel data here. This is the first data I linked in. Again, I can drag and drop that up, so I can connect multiple data sources into a process step or into my process. But it's much easier for me just to automatically link it. It's faster. Again, I'll associate a data column name here. They collect the requirements with the shape text, and I'm finished. So now the data is connected to the shapes, but it's really not exposed on the shape in a way that's useful to us. So let me show you just sort of what's happened. Here's the shape data. And you can see I've added in the status here, right? Same status is down here. The step number, the name of this particular step, and then the average days comes from the data source over here, the SharePoint list. So to make this interesting, I'm going to go back. I'm going to close the external data window, and I'm going to apply some data graphics to turn this into an intuitive dashboard. So I stay in the Data tab. I go over to the Data Graphics option here. And I'm going to apply a data graphic, and then I'll show you really what's involved in doing that. So it's just applying some graphics to make it visual. We've got it now. And what you can see is we've got some colors going here. We've got an icon, some check marks, exclamation point, and some X's down here at the bottom. And then we have a data bar to the right-hand side. Let me show you how you actually do that. I'll go back to the data graphics. This time I'm going to edit. And you'll see that I've selected the data for my data sources. These are in the shapes. And I have status, which is color by value. If I go in and edit that, you'll see that I simply can type in the labels that I want here. And then selecting the color is just like selecting color in any other Microsoft application. I just pick a color that I like and select it. And then I can go in and I can look at the average days, that data bar on the right-hand side. And if I edit that, you'll notice that I have a wide range of data bars from which I can select here: speedometers, a thermometer, stars, and so on. I'll stick with what I've got. And then I can actually format that down below, setting up what's the range, the position of the data within the data bar, how large is the font, and so on. And then lastly, for my icons, again, I can come in and I have a lot of icons I can pick from: smiley faces, various forms of traffic lights, and so on. And to actually take advantage of those, set those ranges, you can see it's a simple set of drop-downs, right? Words like equals, does not equal, contains, does not contain. Very, very simple conditional statements that you pick from a drop-down. And then actually changing the data range is just typing in whatever ranges I want. I can change these to 8 and then click OK, and I can apply those. So it's very wizard-like. It's very accessible to end users. And let's finish this up. So now I have this view of data that's dynamic, connected to my process. If I'm going to share this, I'm going to add a legend here. So I'll add a legend with one click so everybody knows what the colors mean, what the ranges are. And now I'm ready to do what I think is the most exciting part of this, which is I can publish this to SharePoint or to Office 365 so that everybody else in my team can take a look at it and have the same up-to-date view. So I'll go back to the Backstage view that AJ talked about. I click on Save to SharePoint. I pick the location within SharePoint, and then I'm going to come down and I select the format called Web Drawing here, and then I select Save As. And I'll save it up here on the SharePoint site. Now what it's doing in the background is it's binding the data sources, that Excel spreadsheet and that SharePoint list, to the file so that when I move it from my desktop out into SharePoint, those connections are maintained, and it becomes that dashboard or that business activity monitoring out in the browser. So we're back in SharePoint 2010 at this point. I'm in Internet Explorer. You can see that I can pan and zoom. If I zoom in, I've got very nice fidelity here because of the graphics that we use. The legend is here. Now, I told you that this is dynamic, so let me go in and actually change this for you. I'll do it on the Collect the Requirements step here. We've got a check mark here, and we've got a data bar. Why don't I just go change those quickly? So the check mark means it's between 1 and 8, and the data bar is the number. So I'm going to go to change it to something over 13 so that we get a dramatic change. I'm going to go back into my my SharePoint list here, and I'll just come over to this data element, and I'm going to edit it. And we want to change it over 13, so why don't I change that to, say, 16. I'll save that. And I'll go back over to my diagram, and now I'm going to refresh it. There are multiple ways to refresh the data. One is you can simply click on the refresh button. You'll see that we've gone now to the X. We've gone to 16 here from what we had before. Anytime I go to a Visio diagram in SharePoint that's published to Visio services, the data automatically updates. And you can also set the data to refresh manually. If you want SharePoint to go out and pull the data periodically and update, it will do that as well. So what have I showed you? I've showed you taking a Visio diagram, process map, connecting it to a couple of data sources, applying some data graphics to it, publishing it to SharePoint 2010, or you could publish it to the cloud in SharePoint Online, and now I have a very visual dashboard that anybody else can get access to that has a browser and has rights to that site. I don't need Visio locally installed to be able to see this. Now I'll show you one other more advanced way you can use these Visio Webparts. I'm still in SharePoint 2010, and in this case I'm looking at a Visio Webpart here, Visio services for a cross-functional flowchart, very similar to what AJ showed you. And I have two other web parts on this page. I have one here that's blank, and I have a set of radio buttons. So you can see that I've documented the process here, the wholesale quote process. We've connected it to some data and applied some data graphics. So we're doing that sort of business activity monitoring. But now I have the ability in SharePoint to click on a process step and use these diagrams as part of a mashup or a composite application. So if I click on this process step, I can surface other information in the right-hand side. Or I can click here and bring up other information. So what it's doing is allowing that process map that you've developed to become actionable within an application. And the information you surface in this other web part can be anything. It could be all the documentation related to that process. It can be the current set of purchase orders that need to be reviewed. Whatever you want to surface there, you can surface. The interaction can be two-way. I have a third web part here. I mentioned these radio buttons. If I click on, say, Robert Dale, if you can see that, you'll see that it highlights which processes he's responsible for. If I look at Rodrigo, he's responsible for a couple of other processes. So I won't spend a lot of time here. This is more advanced, but I want to leave you with this idea that the Visio diagrams now can be part of process applications. It can actually open up some very interesting ways. Using the process documentation as the UI to get to additional documentation related to the process is very powerful. It's something that we're looking at Microsoft. And if we go back to my slides, we have a customer in Australia. This is an engineering services company called John Holland that is doing that. They have 5,000 to 6,000 employees involved in multiple projects across Asia Pacific, and they had a very basic problem, which is how do people involved in specific parts of a process get context for their steps and understand the entire process. And they developed essentially something similar to what I just showed you, where the process map becomes the user interface to get more information about the process steps. They also use Visio and some of the other things that AJ and I showed you as well as part of this. But I think you can see from the top that they've really elevated Visio and Visio to SharePoint to something very strategic and far beyond the way you may have thought about Visio in your organization historically. So we've given you exposure to some of the new ways you can use Visio and SharePoint for business process management and business process analysis. This is just a subset of some of the customers that are already getting value. I think the important thing for you to take away is that the things we've showed you basically rely on integrated value with other Microsoft products that you've got. We're not showing you things that require a lot of coding. The mashups or composites I just showed you have a very light amount of JavaScripting that may be beyond the average user. But everything else here is out of the box, something that we think you can benefit from and you and your organization can adopt very quickly and see results from. We know that many of you are also involved in, end-to-end processes that may involve system-to-system automation. The things we've showed you today are really focused on human and document-centric workflows. We think we add great value there, and we've added tremendous new capabilities beyond what you may have been using Visio for today. If you need that full business process management suite, we have a great set of partners that are listed there. They build on Visio. They build on other Microsoft infrastructure that your company may have invested in, and we'd encourage you to go look at them. Now with that, I'm going to drop back and I'm going to spend some time. AJ and I are happy to take some questions. So I'm going to drop out of this, and I'm going to go back to GoToMeeting, and let's take a look at some of the questions here. Okay, I see a very good question here. Can you add auto numbering to the shapes in Visio? And I assume that question is, can you auto number as you drop the shapes on the canvas, which is a pretty common question. The answer is you can, but it requires just a little bit of additional work to make that work. We actually did add auto numbering into the Microsoft solution, and there was a little bit of customization to make that work, but yes, it can be done. Let's see, I see another question here. Let's see. I assume none of the functionality discussed here isn't available in MOS 2007. You are correct. The SharePoint integration is available in the SharePoint integration I showed you is in SharePoint 2010 and Office 365. The ability to link data to shapes, which I showed you, is available in Visio 2007 Professional, but you cannot publish those to SharePoint. So you can do everything pretty much I showed you in that last example, except you can't publish it to SharePoint. Will the slides be available for participants? Absolutely. I know that we threw a ton of information at you. That was somewhat by design, to be honest with you. And I will provide you with links before we end the webinar that has sources of more information. So we have videos, for example, and a lot of what I showed you, and how-tos and this sort of thing, because you're right, we've given you a lot of information. Let's see, there's a question here. Let's see, I'm just going through these questions. I think I'm looking for the other ones. What version of Visio 2010 are we looking at? We are looking at a version called Visio Premium 2010. I have a link for the download if you want to get a free trial of that. You can do that. 60-day trial out on the website. Okay, I might as well address. I see a couple of questions around what about BPMN 2.0, because we support 1.2 today. We recognize the need to support BPMN 2.0. We know that people are beginning to adopt that. And I don't have specific timing today other than say we're looking hard at it. We recognize it as important to many of our users. And, you know, we'll have more to say about that down the road. But it is something we do expect to support in the future. Let's see, the links you mentioned, yes. Is there okay, the auto size of the lanes and shapes seems very large for complex processes. Is there a recommended size ratio for pools with more than 5 lanes? Yeah, we actually do. There's 2 ways of handling that. We do have auto sizing. When he actually was zooming in a bit so that it was difficult maybe to get a sense of the proportions. And the other thing you can do is you can actually grab the swim lane, you know, left click and grab that swim lane and adjust the height. Let's see. I'm just continuing down here, kind of scanning these. Yeah, I see another question on the simulations. My suggestion there would be that if you go out to the Visio website, you'll see some partners that have that, and you look at that specifically. There will be links out there for Global 360, for ProModel, and others that provide that. And it's best for you to actually follow up on that one.
And the great thing about those partner solutions, though, is that they come as add-ins, they come as tabs in that ribbon user interface. And so Chris showed you, how he had the Global 360 add-in installed in this Visio, but that's the way those simulation add-ins work. You don't have to leave the product. It's within that familiar user interface, and so we feel like that's a pretty big advantage for us.
Yeah. So let's see, what else have I got here? Is SharePoint Designer standard? Can SharePoint users get it? Or is it only for developers? SharePoint Designer is a free tool. You can go download it. We tend to think of it more as an IT pro or a little bit more technical tool, only because you need to have a pretty good understanding of SharePoint workflow for it to be useful to you. But it's freely available, and we think systems analysts and stuff should easily be able to work with it. Possible to integrate other products with SharePoint 2010. Not clear quite what you want there, but obviously SharePoint's a platform as well, and so we have a wide variety of partners that can build applications on it. There's also functionality within SharePoint to integrate with various line of business systems, bring in various data sources. So there's a lot of capabilities in SharePoint.
Well, and just the product that Microsoft announced yesterday, Office 365, which is now available, integrates SharePoint with some of the other server products as well as the Office, the actual familiar client with Excel, Outlook, etc. So,
yeah. Let's see. Will there be a Mac version of Visio? We do get this question from time to time, so I might as well answer it. Not running. Nothing planned near term for running on the Mac operating system. So your options there are really dual boot, running in a virtual machine with Windows, which I'm sure you're already familiar with, or running it via some third-party solution like Microsoft Terminal Services or a Citrix ICA client or something like that. Check diagrams. Is there a limit to the number of rules? To the number of rules, no, not really. We have quite a long, we have a pretty complete set of rules that we already ship in the box related to BPMN and SharePoint workflow. So if you're interested more in the ability to validate against business rules, there is a book by David Parker that you can find, which is actually called Microsoft Visio 2010 Business Process Diagramming and Validation. You can find it out for sale at Amazon and on the internet. So there is a complete guide there. We also have some white papers up on that. Some of these questions I'm not 100% clear on what's being asked. Let's see. Can you, let's see, can you export data from Visio to Excel for statistical process control? Does Visio have functions which would enable value stream mapping? So we do have a value stream template. That value stream template can be connected to data. We also, one of our partners can do simulation within value stream, within the value stream template that we've got. Yes, you certainly can export the data into Excel. It's really a one-click export, and that ability exists in prior versions of Excel as well. It's obviously organized a little bit differently because we don't have a tabular view in the earlier versions, but yes, you can export it. Okay, so Visio services implementation, how often can you ping, essentially how often can you update the
data refresh?
What's the data refresh rate? It's really determined by you and by the latency in SharePoint. So there's nothing in Visio itself that limits that. we wouldn't recommend this for sort of real-time process control. This shouldn't be your monitor for anything where absolute, split-second data refresh makes sense. But, if you want to update it every 5 minutes, every couple of minutes, you can certainly set it to do that. It's really then determined upon, how do you want to use your bandwidth and how, your SharePoint resources and any latency that's there. Aside from the help file, what other references are available to learn these functions? There are a couple of different things you can do. One, there are a couple of books that are out. There is a Visio step-by-step guide that was just written by one of our MVPs called Scott Helmers out on Amazon. It's very affordable and it's quite comprehensive. And there are also exercises and templates you can download for sort of hands-on lab. We have a number of resources out on the website link I'll give you in a couple of minutes. And you'll find videos and how-tos out there. Okay, we are on the hour, so I think what I will do is go back. I want to respect your time, and I want to, of course, close this. Yep. Go back to the slide. Let me sort of talk about the resources that are available. Okay. So for more information, you can go out to the links here, visiotoolbox.com. There's information on sort of the process maturity that we walked you through, videos as well as white papers out there. If you're interested in any more of the case studies, those are available. There's some videos as well as written case studies. The free trial, you can find that link off the website. And we also talked about offering you guys some white papers and sample templates for using Visio 2010 for business process, compliance, and quality. And so there is a link here, and I think that Modern Analysts will also post that link. We will supply the slides for this webinar at the end of this. They will post that up. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody very much for attending. We hope this has been useful. And I will turn it back to Ben to close it out.
Well, thank you, Chris and AJ, for a very informative presentation, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days, and this concludes today's event, so we hope you have a great day.